The Irish Potato Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, is one of the most tragic and defining events in Irish history. The famine took place from 1845 to 1852, and it left a permanent mark on the country and its people. It's an event that still gets talked about today, with many people looking back at the impact it had on Ireland's culture, economy, and population. But what exactly happened, and why was this famine so devastating? At its core, the famine was caused by the failure of the potato crop, which was a major food source for the Irish population. The potato had become the staple crop for many Irish peasants, especially in rural areas. It was a cheap and easy crop to grow, and it provided a reliable source of nutrition for families, particularly those living in poverty. However, in 1845, a disease called phytophthora, infestans, also known as potato blight, began to spread across Ireland, wiping out entire crops of potatoes. This blight made the potatoes rot, leaving them inedible, and causing an immediate food shortage. The situation quickly worsened, with the blight returning year after year, making it impossible to harvest enough potatoes to feed the population. By 1847, the crisis was in full swing, and famine was widespread. It wasn't just a bad crop failure here and there. The entire food system of Ireland was brought to its knees, but while the cause of the famine seems simple, a failed potato crop, the true reasons behind the tragedy go much deeper, and it's here where we begin to see the full scope of the disaster. The Irish population was already struggling under difficult conditions before the famine hit. Ireland, under British rule at the time, had long been a poor and exploited country. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, which meant they didn't own their land and were at the mercy of landlords who often raised rents. The land was divided into small plots, and these small farmers were forced to rely heavily on a single crop for their survival: the potato. This over-reliance on one crop made the population vulnerable to disaster when that crop failed. But the potato blight wasn't the only factor that made the famine so deadly. The British government's response, or rather lack of response, made the situation even worse. The British authorities at the time believed in a policy called laissez-faire, which essentially meant that they thought the market should take care of things without interference. The idea was that people should be left to fend for themselves, and that the government should not be directly involved in providing aid. This hands-off approach proved to be disastrous, especially in a crisis like the potato famine. The Irish people needed help, but the British government was slow to act. When they did intervene, it was often too little, too late, or poorly executed. British officials focused on sending food exports out of Ireland, believing that they would be more useful to the economy if shipped abroad rather than being used to help the starving population. This policy was met with growing outrage and despair as people continued to starve. As the famine stretched on, the death toll began to rise dramatically. It's estimated that over 1 million people died from hunger, disease, and malnutrition. Thousands more fled Ireland, seeking refuge in other countries, particularly the United States. The mass emigration created a diaspora of Irish people who would carry the memory of the famine with them for generations. The impact was so profound that it reshaped Ireland's demographic makeup, and many Irish families would never return to their homeland. In the midst of this devastation, the Irish people displayed incredible resilience despite the British government's failures. Local communities banded together to provide what little support they could. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and groups organized protests in an attempt to bring attention to the famine's severity. While the government was slow to act, the Irish people's determination to survive and support one another was remarkable. So, what does this all mean? The Irish potato famine was not just a natural disaster caused by a crop failure. It was a tragedy born out of a combination of bad weather, political neglect, and social inequality. It was a moment in history that changed Ireland forever, and its legacy continues to shape the country today. But as we'll see in the next part, the famine was more than just a tragic event. It was also a turning point that would spark change and lead to a rethinking of how governments should respond to disaster and human suffering. Stay tuned as we explore more of the complexities of the Irish potato famine and how its lasting impact continues to echo through history. The Irish potato famine wasn't just a disaster caused by the failure of a single crop. The broader circumstances in Ireland made the famine much worse and helped fuel its devastating consequences. Before the blight ever arrived, Ireland was already struggling under a system of inequality and poverty that made it highly vulnerable to disaster. The impact of the famine was deeply tied to a mix of British colonial policies, the structure of Irish society, and economic pressures that had been building for years. By the time the famine hit, much of the Irish population had already been living in dire conditions. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, meaning they rented their land from landlords rather than owning it. This system left farmers at the mercy of rent demands, and when times were tough, they had little control over their ability to provide for their families. The Irish peasants were heavily reliant on the land for survival, but the small plots of land they worked on made them extremely vulnerable to crop failures. The widespread use of the potato as the main source of food meant that when the crop failed, so did the livelihoods of the people. Over-reliance on the potato wasn't just a cultural choice, it was the result of economic pressures that forced many Irish farmers to rely on a single crop for survival. During the early 1800s, the British government passed a series of laws that severely restricted the rights of Irish tenants. These laws made it harder for Irish farmers to hold on to their land and forced many to depend on a crop that could be grown quickly and on small plots, the potato. The potato was cheap to grow, nutritious, and could feed entire families, but its widespread use across Ireland made the country highly vulnerable to any problems with the crop. When the potato blight first hit in 1845, it was a major shock, but the true devastation didn't set in until later. The blight wiped out nearly half of Ireland's potato crop in that year alone, but it wasn't just the blight that caused mass starvation. The social and economic structures of Ireland made the problem far worse. Without enough food to feed the population, Irish peasants had few options. Many were already living on the edge with little access to proper nutrition or medical care. With so many people relying on potatoes for their daily diet, there were few alternative food sources when the crop failed. The British government, which ruled over Ireland at the time, didn't seem to fully grasp the scale of the crisis. British officials were primarily concerned with the economy and maintaining control over Ireland, not the well-being of the Irish people. As the famine worsened, the British government was slow to respond. They didn't want to interfere with what they saw as the natural workings of the market, even as millions were starving. This laissez-faire attitude, which means letting things take their course without interference, meant that very little relief was provided to the Irish people. Instead of sending aid, British policies focused on exporting food from Ireland, thinking that keeping the economy going would eventually solve the problem. But this decision only made things worse, as food was being taken from the country while millions of people went hungry. Meanwhile, the British government passed laws like the infamous Gregory Clause, which prohibited relief to anyone who owned more than a quarter of an acre of land. This clause was meant to encourage the poor to leave their farms and seek work elsewhere, but in practice, it left many with a choice between starvation or homelessness. In the face of all this hardship, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves. Despite the lack of government assistance, many communities took matters into their own hands. People organized soup kitchens, helped one another with what little food they had, and worked together to try to survive. There were also protests and demonstrations as the Irish people expressed their anger at the British government's inaction. While many suffered in silence, these acts of defiance showed that the Irish people were far from helpless. They had a fierce determination to survive, even in the worst of circumstances. As the famine stretched on, more and more people died, not just from starvation, but from diseases like typhus and dysentery, which spread quickly in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The death toll is hard to estimate precisely, but it's believed that at least 1 million people died during the famine. In addition to the deaths, millions of others were forced to leave Ireland in search of a better life. The Irish diaspora, particularly to the United States, grew dramatically during and after the famine, as people fled the dire conditions in Ireland. The mass emigration that followed had a lasting impact on Ireland. Entire communities were lost, and the population of Ireland dropped by about a quarter. This also meant that the famine's consequences were felt not just in Ireland, but in the countries where Irish immigrants settled, especially in America. The legacy of the famine shaped the identity of the Irish people for generations, influencing both the Irish who remained in Ireland and those who started new lives in foreign lands. So what was the impact of all this? The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was a turning point in Ireland's history. The failure of the British government to provide meaningful assistance during this crisis led to deep resentment and anger toward the British. Many Irish people began to see the famine as a direct result of British colonialism and policies that treated the Irish as second-class citizens. This anger would eventually lead to a push for independence and reform in the following decades. The potato famine, while a tragedy, also played a key role in shaping Ireland's path to the modern era. As we continue to explore the deeper complexities of the famine, we can start to see the long-lasting effects it had on both Ireland and its people. It wasn't just a period of loss, but one of profound change. Stay tuned on for the next part of this story, where we will look at how the British government's policies and the Irish response to the famine set the stage for the future. As the famine deepened, the effects of British policies became even more apparent. The British government's response, or lack of it, was one of the most controversial aspects of the Potato Famine. While the Irish population struggled to survive, the British government continued to follow a policy of non-intervention, under the belief that market forces would eventually balance things out. But this idea, which worked in some situations, was disastrous when applied to the desperate conditions in Ireland. The British approach ignored the scale of the crisis, the unique situation in Ireland, and the human suffering that was taking place. The economic theory of laissez-faire, which believed in minimal government involvement, was ill-suited to handle such a catastrophic event. At the heart of this failure was a series of decisions that prioritized economic interest over human lives. One of the most glaring examples of this was the continued export of food from Ireland during the famine. Even though millions of people were starving, Ireland's ports were still exporting grain, meat, and other essential foodstuffs to Britain and other countries. This was driven by the British government's economic policies, which prioritized keeping trade flowing and maintaining the stability of the market. While Irish people were dying from hunger, their own resources were being shipped abroad. To make matters worse, when relief efforts were provided, they were either too little or too late and often poorly managed. The British government set up workhouses where the Irish could go for food and shelter, but these were overcrowded and poorly maintained, and many people were turned away. The workhouse conditions were so bad that many would rather risk starvation than enter them. Public works projects were also introduced, but these too failed to alleviate the suffering. While some infrastructure was built, the projects were insufficient to meet the needs of the population, and the workers were often paid poorly, which made it hard for them to support their families. British relief efforts were slow, ineffective, and often seen as an afterthought rather than a true attempt to save lives. The British government also imposed policies that were seen as punitive rather than helpful. One of the most infamous examples of this was the introduction of the Gregory Clause in 1847. This clause, named after Sir William Gregory, a British politician, stated that only those who owned less than a quarter of an acre of land were eligible for relief. The idea was to encourage people to leave their land and go to the cities to find work, but in practice, this policy devastated the Irish poor, forcing many of them to choose between starvation or giving up their homes. It was a clear example of how the British government's response was more concerned with maintaining social control than with alleviating the suffering of the Irish people. Meanwhile, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves, and they responded in ways that showed both their resilience and frustration. As the government failed to act, communities began to organize their own relief efforts. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and people worked together to support one another. In many areas, the Irish created their own forms of resistance, including protests and demonstrations, to demand better treatment from the British authorities. Though these actions were often small and localized, they demonstrated the defiance and strength of the Irish people. They refused to accept the status quo, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. But even with the best efforts of the Irish people, the famine continued to rage. Over the course of the famine, it's estimated that 1 million people died from hunger and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, mainly to the United States, where Irish immigrants began to form a significant part of the population. The Irish diaspora, which had been growing steadily, swelled dramatically during and after the famine. Many of those who survived found themselves starting over in foreign lands, leaving behind the poverty and despair that had gripped their homeland. The emigration caused by the famine had lasting effects on both Ireland and the countries that received the Irish immigrants. In Ireland, the population dropped by nearly a quarter, and entire communities were lost. Those who stayed behind were left with the memory of the tragedy and the resentment toward the British government that would continue for decades. For the Irish immigrants, the famine was a defining moment. It shaped their identity and played a role in the rise of Irish nationalism, particularly in the United States. The Irish, who had once been seen as an underclass in their homeland, now began to rise in prominence in their new communities, fueled by the trauma of the famine and their desire for a better life. The Irish Potato Famine was not just a food crisis, it was also a political and social crisis. It exposed the deep inequalities that existed in Ireland and the callousness of British policies toward the Irish people. It showed how British colonialism, combined with the lack of effective government response, could lead to catastrophic consequences. And it revealed the strength and determination of the Irish people, who refused to accept their fate and found ways to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. By the time the famine began to subside in 1852, its effects were already felt far and wide. The social, political, and cultural landscape of Ireland had been forever altered. The famine had not only caused immense human suffering, but it also ignited a spark of resistance that would continue to burn in Ireland for years to come. As we look at the aftermath of the famine and its lasting impact on Irish society, we can begin to understand why this event is still so deeply felt today. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where we will examine the long-term effects of the famine on both Ireland and the world. As the years passed after the Irish Potato Famine, the long-term effects of the tragedy continued to shape both Ireland and the broader world. The loss of nearly a quarter of the Irish population, both in death and emigration, left Ireland in a state of deep social and economic upheaval. Entire communities had been wiped out, and those who remained were often traumatized by the horrific events they had witnessed. The famine's aftermath was not just about dealing with immediate starvation and poverty. It was about the profound psychological scars it left on the Irish people and their sense of identity. One of the most significant effects of the famine was the mass emigration of the Irish population, particularly to the United States. An estimated 1 million Irish men, women, and children left Ireland during and after the famine, seeking a better life across the Atlantic. This migration was not just a flight from hunger, it was a desperate attempt to escape the economic and political circumstances that had contributed to the famine in the first place. The Irish, who left behind their homeland, found themselves in a strange new world, where they faced their own set of challenges, but also the possibility of a fresh start. In the United States, Irish immigrants were often met with hostility and discrimination, as many Americans viewed them as a poor, uneducated, and undesirable group. However, over time, the Irish immigrants would prove themselves to be resilient and hardworking, slowly carving out a place for themselves in American society. They became an important part of the labor force, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where they worked in factories, on railroads, and in construction. The Irish also began to build their own communities, churches, and institutions, creating a strong cultural identity that was rooted in their experiences of hardship and survival. This massive wave of immigration would also have significant effects on the political landscape of the United States. The Irish immigrants, many of whom were poor and working class, found a voice in the country's burgeoning labor movement. They played an instrumental role in pushing for better working conditions, higher wages, and the right to form unions. The Irish also became increasingly involved in politics, with Irish Americans eventually rising to power in major cities and even in the US Congress. This political influence would continue to grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Irish Americans became a formidable political force in the United States. Back in Ireland, the effects of the famine were no less profound. The population had been decimated, and the country's rural economy was in shambles. The devastation caused by the failure of the potato crop, coupled with the economic policies of the British government, had left the Irish people with little means of recovery. The lack of investment in the country's infrastructure and the British government's continued neglect only exacerbated the situation. Despite the aid provided by Irish communities and immigrants abroad, recovery was slow. The land itself had been severely damaged by years of over-reliance on the potato, and many farmers were unable to rebuild their livelihoods. The famine also brought to the forefront the deep political and social divisions between the Irish people and the British government. The anger and resentment toward British policies that had fueled the famine never fully dissipated. In fact, the famine became a rallying point for Irish nationalism. Many Irish began to view the famine as a clear example of British neglect and oppression, and it strengthened calls for Irish independence. The memory of the famine would continue to fuel political movements in Ireland for decades, and it played a significant role in the push for home rule and eventually full independence. In the decades following the famine, the Irish people began to rebuild their communities and their country. Despite the devastating loss of life and the trauma left by the famine, the Irish displayed remarkable resilience. They sought to preserve their culture, language, and traditions, even as they faced tremendous odds. The Irish language, which had been in decline for years, experienced a revival as a symbol of national pride and resistance to British control. Cultural institutions, such as theatres, museums, and schools, were founded to promote Irish identity and history. In the global context, the Irish potato famine also had far-reaching effects. It is often seen as a catalyst for broader social and political movements, particularly in relation to food security and the rights of colonized peoples. The famine highlighted the dangers of monoculture farming, the over-reliance on a single crop, and the vulnerabilities of agricultural societies. It also exposed the risks of unchecked market policies and the devastating impact they can have on vulnerable populations. The global awareness of the Irish tragedy led to increased activism for food aid and social justice, as well as growing support for movements that sought to protect the rights of the impoverished and disenfranchised. Over time, the Irish potato famine became a symbol of survival and struggle. It was a defining moment in Irish history that continued to shape the country's political, social, and cultural landscape. The famine not only reshaped the lives of those who lived through it, but also left a legacy of activism and resistance that would echo throughout generations. As we reflect on the effects of the famine, we begin to see how such tragedies can spark change, giving rise to new ideas and movements that push for justice and equality. In the next part of this story, we will explore how the famine continues to impact Irish identity and global memory, and how its legacy is still felt today. As we reach the final part of this story, it's important to reflect on the long-lasting impact of the Irish potato famine and how it continues to shape Ireland and its people today. The Great Hunger, as it's often called, remains one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, and its repercussions can still be felt across the world. The famine was not just a devastating loss of life, it was a pivotal moment that changed the course of history in Ireland, influenced the global political landscape, and left an imprint on generations of Irish people, both in Ireland and abroad. One of the most profound ways the famine has shaped Irish identity is through the deep sense of loss and survival that remains at the core of the national consciousness. For many Irish people, the memory of the famine is not just about the tragedy of those years, but about the strength and resilience of those who endured it. Even as the famine devastated Ireland, it also created a new sense of unity among the Irish people, one that transcended geographical boundaries. The shared experience of suffering and loss became a bond that would last for generations, uniting the Irish diaspora around the world. This sense of solidarity can still be seen today, especially in the way the Irish community comes together to remember the victims of the famine. Every year, on the anniversary of the famine's peak, Irish people hold memorials and events to honor those who perished and to reflect on the ongoing struggles faced by marginalized communities. These events serve as a reminder of the resilience of the Irish people, and they continue to foster a deep sense of pride in the country's history, culture, and ability to overcome adversity. The legacy of the famine also extends to the political and social movements that it inspired, particularly in Ireland's fight for independence. The trauma of the famine played a significant role in the rise of Irish nationalism, as many began to view British colonial rule as the cause of their suffering. This sentiment fueled the demand for Irish self-rule and eventually led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. The Irish nationalist movement, which gained momentum after the famine, would go on to shape the political landscape of Ireland for much of the 20th century. In addition to its role in fostering Irish nationalism, the famine also had a lasting effect on the global awareness of food security, colonial exploitation, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The Irish potato famine highlighted the dangers of food dependency and the devastating consequences of market-driven policies that put profits before people's well-being. It also shone a spotlight on the effects of British imperialism, which had already been a point of contention for many colonized nations. The world began to take a closer look at the treatment of impoverished populations, and the tragedy of the famine led to increased advocacy for social justice, humanitarian aid, and more equitable agricultural practices. While the Irish potato famine may have been a disaster of incomprehensible scale, it also acted as a catalyst for change on both a national and global level. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in history continue to influence policies on food security, the rights of the oppressed, and the importance of government responsibility in times of crisis. Today, as we reflect on the famine, we are reminded of how human-made tragedies can be caused by a mix of greed, neglect, and inequality, and how those tragedies, though painful, can also spark movements that fight for justice and human dignity. In Ireland, the memory of the Potato Famine continues to be a symbol of perseverance and hope. It reminds the Irish people, and indeed the world, that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always the possibility for renewal and change. The famine, with all its devastation, laid the groundwork for a stronger, more independent nation and a more engaged and compassionate global community. Through the pain and the loss, Ireland found a renewed sense of purpose and identity, one that would go on to shape the country's future and its place in the world. As we conclude this story, we can't help but see the Irish Potato Famine as more than just a tragic event. It is a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The famine not only shaped the course of Irish history, but it also shaped the world's understanding of hunger, colonization, and the need for social change. And in the end, it serves as a powerful reminder of the ways in which even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. Thank you for taking this journey through history with me, and I hope this story has given you a deeper understanding of one of the most devastating yet transformative events in Irish history,